Tonight, you're not in your bedroom. You're in the heart of ancient Jerusalem, where the stones remember, and the wind still hums the Psalms of Kings. The air is thick with myrrh. Golden oil burns in shallow bowls, and far above, the moon casts silver light on the highest rooftop of the temple. And there, standing alone, is a man, wrapped in silence, crowned in gold, feared by nations, loved by poets, and followed by the weight of wisdom too heavy to carry. His name was Solomon, a son of David, a builder of holy places, a judge of hearts, a seeker of meaning, a king who had it all and still lost himself. So tonight, as the world fades and your body begins to rest, I invite you to breathe in. Let the noise of the day disappear. Let your mind drift softly through time. And if this story reaches your heart, feel free to leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. I read everyone. And if these words speak to your soul, you're welcome to subscribe. This space is for you. Now, close your eyes and let me take you back to the beginning of a promise and the weight of a crown. Before the gold, before the temple, before the fame, the wisdom, the women, there was only silence. A prince without a voice, living in the shadow of a father who had changed the course of history. David was gone, and the crown now rested on Solomon's head. But crowns aren't light, and this one carried more than gold. It carried prophecy. It carried pressure. It carried the memory of a man after God's own heart, and the expectation that the son would somehow do more. Solomon was young, not foolish, but far from ready. He had watched battles, but never led one. He had read scrolls, but never written laws. He slept in the same palace halls his father walked, but everything felt colder now. Every corner whispered, "Are you enough?" He was not the strongest of David's sons, not the boldest, and yet he had been chosen. Bathsheba, his mother, had secured his path to the throne. But it wasn't politics that sealed it. It was the promise. God had told David that Solomon would build the temple, a resting place for the presence of the Most High. But how do you build a house for a God who fills the heavens? How do you lead a people who remember your father's victories better than your own name? In those first days, Solomon did not command. He listened. He stood among warriors and counselors, nodding quietly, learning their language, studying their eyes. And when night came, he didn't ask for strategy. He asked for understanding. One night, he left the city alone. No guards, no servants, just silence. He walked to Gibeon, where the high place waited, a place soaked in centuries of sacrifice. There, he offered 1,000 burnt offerings, not out of tradition, but out of surrender. That night, with smoke still rising into the stars, Solomon fell asleep. And in that sleep, God came near. No thunder, no shaking earth. Just a question. Ask for whatever you want me to give you. The boy, now king, could have asked for power, wealth, victory, long life. But he asked for none of those. He whispered, "Give me wisdom, a heart that understands, so I can lead your people with justice." And heaven paused, then smiled. The voice replied, "Because you asked for wisdom, and not for riches, not for honor, not for death to your enemies. I will give you wisdom like no one before you, and I will give you all the rest as well." When Solomon awoke, his eyes opened slowly, but something deeper had awakened inside him. He looked at his hands. They still shook, but now they carried something else. Purpose. The boy who had once stood in the shadow of giants now stood in the light of something eternal. And history was about to change. The dream never left him. Even when the sun rose, even when the palace stirred awake, even when servants knocked softly at his door, Solomon felt it. That voice, that weight, that clarity that didn't come from ambition, or bloodlines, or rituals. It came from somewhere deeper. And now, he had to carry it. The kingdom was his. The throne was no longer a symbol. It was a seat waiting for decisions, for laws, for justice. And the people, they were watching. They didn't need a boy with good manners. They needed a king with wisdom. And God was listening too. So Solomon sat, listened, watched, learned. The first great test came quietly, not on a battlefield, not with swords, but with sorrow. 2 women came before him, their faces tired, their voices raw from weeping. They lived in the same house. Each had given birth to a child, but one child had died. Now both women claimed the living baby was theirs. There were no witnesses, no scrolls, no proof, just a baby, and a terrible choice. Solomon didn't raise his voice, didn't pace the floor. He looked at them and said something no one expected. "Bring me a sword." The room fell silent. A sword? Was this justice? Was this madness? The guard stepped forward, unsure. Solomon spoke again. "Cut the child in 2. Give half to each woman." One woman gasped. She stepped back, eyes wide with horror. The other stood tall, silent. And then, the woman who had gasped cried out, "No, give her the baby. Please don't kill him." And Solomon smiled. "Do not harm the child. She is the true mother." The people were stunned. This wasn't power. This wasn't force. This was wisdom. A wisdom that saw past words, past appearances, and into the heart. From that moment on, the people knew God was with him. Solomon's name began to travel. Beyond the hills, beyond the borders, traders spoke of him in markets. Nomads carried stories through deserts. Even kings from far lands began to listen. But Solomon didn't rush to conquer. He rushed to build. He remembered the promise. His father David had gathered stones, drawn blueprints, collected cedar from Lebanon, and dreamed of a temple. But God had told David, "You've shed too much blood. Your son will build it." And now, Solomon would fulfill that dream. But before he laid the first stone, he did something rare for a king. He paused. He prayed, "If you don't go with me, this temple is just stone." And so, the work began, stone by stone, beam by beam. He didn't build it in haste. He built it with intention, with reverence, with awe. It would take 7 years. And every day, the city buzzed with movement, not for war, but for worship. Because this wasn't a palace for Solomon. It was a house for the presence of God. And deep down, he knew something. He wasn't just building for Israel. He was building for generations, yet to be born. Jerusalem had never seen anything like it. Every morning, the sound of hammers echoed across the hills. But not like before. These weren't tools of war. They were instruments of worship. Stonecutters carved silently. Woodworkers shaped cedar brought from distant forests. Goldsmiths molded sacred vessels that would never touch blood, only incense and oil. The air was filled with sawdust and prayer, and Solomon walked among them, not as a distant ruler, but as a builder of something holy. The temple would not be large by modern eyes, but in meaning, it was vast. Its foundation was more than limestone. It was covenant. It was promise. It was memory. David had dreamed of this place, but only Solomon would see it rise. He ordered no sound of iron tools be heard on the Temple Mount. Everything was prepared off-site, then assembled in reverent silence. Because this house was not just for God's presence, it was for His name, His glory, His people. Inside, everything shimmered. Walls overlaid with gold, palm trees, flowers, and cherubim carved into every surface. A ceiling of cypress, a floor of fir, bronze pillars that touched the sky. And at the center, the inner sanctuary, the most holy place, a cube of perfect symmetry, dark, sacred, untouched. There, behind the curtain, would rest the Ark of the Covenant, the same ark that traveled with Israel in the wilderness, that split the Jordan, that brought fear and victory. Now, it would have a home. But Solomon knew gold means nothing without glory. So when the day of dedication came, he didn't speak first. He bowed. All of Israel gathered, thousands of priests, singers, elders, and citizens stood together under the sun. And Solomon stood on a platform of bronze, raised his hands to heaven, and prayed. He did not ask for military victory. He did not boast. He asked for presence. Let your eyes be open toward this temple day and night. Hear the prayers of your people. When they sin, when they fall, when they cry out, hear from heaven and forgive. As he spoke, the priests placed the ark in the most holy place. And when they stepped back, something happened. A cloud filled the temple. Not smoke, not dust, but the glory of the Lord. It came like a breath from heaven, thick and luminous, so intense, the priests could not even stand. It was the same cloud that had led Israel by day in the wilderness, the same presence that had descended on Mount Sinai. Now, it rested in the temple. And Solomon, the boy who had once trembled in dreams, stood still, not in fear, but in awe. He turned to the people and whispered, "The Lord has said he would dwell in thick darkness. I have built a dwelling place for him forever." And all of Israel bowed their faces to the ground, not to Solomon, but to the one who had kept his promise. For a moment in history, heaven and earth met in a house made by human hands, not because of power, not because of wealth, but because of obedience and awe. Long after the incense had faded and the last psalm of dedication echoed into silence, Solomon's fame began to spread like light at dawn. But it wasn't his crown they spoke of, nor his armies, nor the temple's golden walls. It was his might, his words, his wisdom, He judged disputes with a calm that disarmed anger. He taught in Proverbs short, sharp truths that pierced like arrows, but healed like balm. People traveled days, even weeks, just to hear him speak. And not just commoners, kings, priests, philosophers, all sat quietly at the feet of a man who once knelt alone on the hills of Gibeon. Solomon didn't speak to impress. He spoke to reveal. He spoke of ants, how they store food in summer, of lions, how their strength is tempered by stillness, of fools, how loud they are when they know nothing, of the heart, how it is more deceitful than the wind. He said, better a little with peace than riches with strife. He warned, pride goes before a fall. Guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. He encouraged, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. And through it all, people listened. They wrote down his sayings. They passed them from father to son, mother to daughter. And still today, those words echo. But Solomon's wisdom wasn't only for daily life. It reached higher. He spoke of creation, of stars and rivers, of trees and storms, of bees and mountains. He saw God's hand, not only in the temple, but in thunder, in silence. In time, he wrote songs, not for fame, but for the soul. Some were songs of love, intimate, mysterious. They spoke of longing, of union, of sacred desire. Others were reflections on meaning, on death, on how even the wisest man cannot stop the wind or hold time in his hands. One book began with words that would haunt the centuries. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. It was not despair. It was honesty. Solomon looked at all he had gained, wealth, knowledge, peace, and still asked, what lasts? And that was the beginning of deeper wisdom. Still, his world grew. Ships sailed under his banner. Silver flowed through his cities like streams. The royal court overflowed with exotic gifts: ivory, apes, peacocks, incense. His palace became a marvel. His throne, carved from ivory, overlaid with gold, stood atop 6 steps with 12 lions carved on either side. He drank from vessels of gold, ate at tables of cedar. His singers played lyres by moonlight. His scribes recorded every word. And then she arrived, the Queen of Sheba, a ruler from a distant land, drawn by the rumors of his wisdom. She came with camels carrying spices, gold, and precious stones. But she didn't come to flatter. She came to test him. She asked questions, hard ones, deep ones, and Solomon answered them all. When she saw the order of his court, the offerings at the temple, the joy of his servants, and the wisdom in his speech, her breath caught. She said, what I heard was true, but not even half was told. How happy your people must be to hear your wisdom every day. And she praised his God, because even she could see this wisdom was not of man alone. Solomon had become more than a king. He was a living riddle, a bridge between heaven and earth, between mystery and meaning. But beneath all the glory, a shadow began to grow. And though the world called him wise, he would soon learn that knowing the truth doesn't mean you live it. Wisdom is a gift, but it is not armor. It doesn't keep out desire. It doesn't silence pride. And in the golden quiet of his palace, with the world at his feet, Solomon began to forget the voice that gave him everything. It started slowly. A treaty here, a royal marriage there. One wife from Egypt, another from Moab, then from Sidon, then from Ammon. Each one brought more than beauty. They brought their gods, and their gods brought altars. And Solomon, the man who built the temple of the Lord, began building high places for idols. He didn't stop praying. He just prayed in more directions. He didn't stop writing. He just wrote less from the Spirit and more from the shadows. He still wore the crown, still judged the people, still quoted the proverbs he once wrote. But inside, something had shifted. The heart that once trembled before God was now divided. The king, who once stood in awe of the cloud in the temple, now lit incense to statues of stone. And the Lord, who had appeared to him twice, who had walked with him since youth, grew silent, because God doesn't share thrones. The scriptures say, Solomon loved many foreign women. But the tragedy wasn't the number. It was the surrender, the slow giving away of everything sacred. He began to worship Molech, a god who demanded children be burned in fire. He built altars to Ashtoreth, goddess of seduction, to Chemosh, god of war and chaos. Not in secret. In public, on the hills outside Jerusalem, the same hills where he once prayed as a boy. And the people followed, because when kings bow to idols, the nation follows their knees. God sent prophets, warnings, whispers, but Solomon was no longer listening. His court was full of songs, but none of them were worship. His rooms overflowed with gold, but none of it felt holy. And though his throne was strong, his soul grew weak. The consequences came like cracks in stone. God spoke one last time. Since your heart has turned away, I will tear the kingdom from your hands. Not in your lifetime, for the sake of your father David, but in your sons. It wasn't punishment. It was sorrow, a letting go. Solomon, once the wisest man in the world, had become the warning, a reminder that no amount of knowledge can protect a heart that forgets who it belongs to. His days grew long, his spirit tired. The songs he once wrote faded into silence. He had everything, and nothing. He had peace around him, but war inside. And one day, while the city below still glowed with wealth and wonder, while scribes still copied his words, while the temple still stood in gold, Solomon sat alone, not as a king, not as a teacher, but as a man who remembered what it felt like to be close to God and knew he had drifted far. He took up a scroll and began to write again. Not proverbs, not praise, but reflections. He looked at the world and wrote what his soul had learned the hard way. That wisdom without obedience is empty. That pleasure without purpose is a vapor. That glory without God is dust. And so began the final words of the king. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Not in bitterness, but in repentance. Not to end the story in defeat, but to leave a candle lit for anyone who might come after and wonder why gold isn't enough. The throne was still golden, the palace still rich, the temple still magnificent. But Solomon was fading, not in strength, not in wealth, but in presence. He walked slower now, spoke less, smiled only with his eyes. The man who once dazzled the world was now more often seen alone, seated by the carved windows of his chamber, watching doves rise above the city he had built. He had written thousands of proverbs, hundreds of songs, built gardens, aqueducts, and palaces. But the lines on his face no longer came from sun and time. They came from regret. He had loved wisdom, but also wandered from it. He had heard the voice of God, but also ignored it. And now, in the quiet of his final years, he lived between memory and mercy. His scribes still came to him. Servants still bowed. But his most frequent companion was silence. It was during these days that he penned the words that would become Ecclesiastes, a book unlike any other, a confession, a warning, a mirror. He wrote, "I denied myself nothing. My eyes desired everything. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind." He was not bitter. He was honest. The man who had once asked for wisdom now offered it again. But from the other side, not as a young king in golden robes, but as an old man in ashes. He spoke of time, of seasons, of birth and death, of laughter and weeping, of building and tearing down. He spoke of injustice, of loneliness, of the futility of riches, and the beauty of simple joys. He said, "Better one handful with peace than two with toil and chasing wind." And beneath every word was a whisper, "Don't do what I did." Because Solomon had learned, a wise man may know the path, but only the obedient one walks it. In his last days, he returned to the temple, not with ceremony, not with spectacle. He walked slowly, his robes trailing behind him like shadows. He stood before the altar, the same altar where fire had once fallen from heaven, and bowed. No one saw him. No one heard his prayer. But God did. And mercy is deeper than failure. We don't know how Solomon died. The scriptures give no dramatic ending, no final words spoken aloud. But his final written words still breathe. Fear God and keep his commandments. For this is the whole duty of man, not because God needs it, but because the soul does. Solomon's death marked the end of a golden era, but also the beginning of unraveling. The peace he had built would not last. The unity he had enjoyed would not endure. His son would inherit the crown, but not the wisdom. And the kingdom of Israel, once united under David and Solomon, would soon fracture. But Solomon left more than a divided kingdom. He left a legacy, a temple, a name, 1,000 lessons carved into time, some told in glory, others in grief, because Solomon was not just the wisest man who ever lived. He was also the most human, capable of vision, capable of failure, capable of returning. And though the gold faded and the empire broke, his story remained as a mirror, as a warning, as a whisper from a king who saw everything and still longed for what truly mattered. Solomon was gone. The king who once held the world in his hands now rested in silence, buried in the city of David. The people mourned, but their eyes soon turned to his son. His name was Rehoboam. He had his father's blood, but not his father's voice, not his wisdom, not his reverence. The crown passed to him, but the weight of it he did not understand. The kingdom Solomon left behind was rich in gold, but poor in unity. 12 tribes gathered under one king, but still divided in heart. They had followed David for his strength. They had followed Solomon for his peace. But Rehoboam would be tested differently. When the time came for his coronation, the tribe sent a delegation. Among them was Jeroboam, a former servant of Solomon, once exiled, now returned. They came with one request. Your father placed a heavy yoke on us. Lighten it, and we will serve you. Rehoboam listened, then sent them away for 3 days. He turned to the elders, the men who had served Solomon. They said, if you serve these people with kindness, they will serve you forever. But Rehoboam didn't like the sound of humility, so he asked his friends instead, the young men he had grown up with in the palace. They said, tell them this, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father whipped you with cords. I will whip you with scorpions. And Rehoboam smiled, not with wisdom, with pride. 3 days later, he spoke those words aloud, cutting into the hearts of a nation, already fraying at the seams. And just like that, the kingdom cracked. 10 tribes turned their backs. They shouted, what share do we have in David? To your tents, O Israel. Only Judah and Benjamin remained. The rest crowned Jeroboam, a servant, a rebel, now a king. What had taken decades to build, a kingdom united under God, fractured in a moment of arrogance. The northern tribes became Israel. The southern became Judah. 2 nations, once brothers, now rivals. The golden age was over. And the temple Solomon built now stood in a divided land. But worse than division was the direction both sides would take. Jeroboam, fearing the people would return to Jerusalem to worship, built 2 golden calves, one in Bethel, one in Dan. He said, here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. And the people believed him. Idolatry returned, not as temptation, as policy. And Judah, though slower to fall, would follow the same path in time. The voices of prophets began to rise, calling, warning, pleading. But kings don't often listen when their thrones feel secure. What Solomon had feared in his later days was coming true. Not just political decay, but spiritual collapse. The land was still beautiful. The crops still grew. The temple still stood. But the heart of the nation was slipping, not from one sin, but from forgetfulness. They forgot the voice in the cloud. They forgot the fire on the altar. They forgot the covenant. And in that forgetting, they drifted. The story of Solomon was now a hinge in history. A door had closed, and another, full of war, exile, and longing, was beginning to open. But even here, in the fracture, God did not leave. He sent messengers, poets, watchmen, to call them home, because even in division, even in rebellion, he was still a father, and he had not forgotten his children.
The crown once rested on one head. Now it was broken in two, north and south, Israel and Judah. Two kings, two altars, two paths slowly drifting in opposite directions, but both away from God. The throne of David had been meant for unity, for justice, for peace, but now it echoed with absence. In the north, Jeroboam ruled with fear, not fear of God, but fear of losing control. So he built more than golden calves. He created priests from anyone, regardless of tribe or calling. He made festivals to mimic the ones in Jerusalem, a counterfeit religion that sounded familiar but smelled of pride. And God saw it all. He sent a prophet, a man unnamed by history, to cry out at the altar of Bethel. The prophet declared, "This altar will be torn apart, and the bones of false priests burned upon it." Jeroboam laughed. He stretched out his hand and shouted, "Seize him." But in that moment, his hand withered, frozen, paralyzed, like time had stopped. The altar cracked, ashes spilled, and the people gasped. Jeroboam begged the prophet, "Please pray for me." And the prophet did. Mercy, even in rebellion. His hand was restored, but his heart was not changed. He continued on, building, rebelling, forgetting. Meanwhile, in the south, Rehoboam ruled Judah. He strengthened the cities, raised armies, fortified walls, and for a time, he walked with God. But comfort breeds complacency, and soon he too built high places, Asherah poles, altars under every tree. The people followed. They mingled truth with tradition, reverence with ritual, until the worship became hollow. God sent Shishak, king of Egypt, to attack. Jerusalem trembled. The temple was spared, but the treasures were taken. The gold shields, symbols of Solomon's glory, were gone. Rehoboam replaced them with bronze. Not the same, but enough to pretend. And so began a pattern. One king after another. Some did right. Many did not. Some remembered David. Most forgot. But always, God sent voices. Prophets in the wilderness. Visions in the night. Warnings wrapped in poetry and fire. They cried out, "Return. You have forsaken the fountain of living water, and dug broken cisterns that hold none." But the kings had their ears full of advisors and ambition. The people had their eyes full of idols and illusion. And yet, God remained, watching, calling, waiting. Because though the crown was cracked, and the temple flickering, and the people scattered in heart, the covenant still breathed. The echo of Solomon's glory was fading, but a deeper song was beginning. One not built on gold, but on grace. A song that whispered, "Even in exile, I will not forget you. Even in darkness, I will be your light." The kingdom had split, but heaven's heart had not. And though judgment would come, it would not be the end, because the story of Israel was never just about kings. It was about a God who keeps his promises even when we don't. Wisdom never truly dies. It sleeps, It waits, and sometimes it returns through unlikely voices. Years had passed. Kings had risen and fallen. Altars built, altars burned, but scattered across the land were still those who remembered. Not the gold, not the politics, but the voice. The voice that spoke to Solomon in a dream. The voice that filled the temple with glory. The voice that whispered, asked for wisdom, and in the quiet places of Judah, some began asking again. There were still scribes, copying the proverbs of old, still mothers whispering psalms as their children slept, still wanderers reciting truth around fires under starlit skies, and among them, a new generation began to rise. Not kings, not warriors, but seekers. Some were prophets, carrying the fire of heaven in their bones. Others were priests, longing for the days when incense meant intimacy. Still others were ordinary men and women, farmers, artisans, widows, who simply remembered what the world had forgotten. They began to return, not to borders, but to belief, to covenant, to trust, to wisdom. Wisdom, they learned, wasn't found only in the throne room. It was found in the field, in the storm, in the stillness before dawn. It whispered from the trees, echoed in the cries of the poor. It waited between the lines of old scrolls, ready to rise again in anyone humble enough to listen. One day, a young king named Josiah discovered a scroll in the temple ruins. It was the book of the law. He read it, tore his robes, wept, and then he led the people in repentance. Not because he was perfect, but because he remembered. Another king, Hezekiah, restored worship in the temple, reopened its doors, removed the idols, and wisdom flowed again through the songs of the Levites. The people sang, "Your word is a lamp to my feet, a light to my path." And for a moment, the nation breathed again, not in victory, but in reverence, because true wisdom is not about knowing all things, but knowing the one who does, even in exile, when the temple would fall, when Jerusalem would weep, when the crown would vanish. Wisdom still found a way. It rose in the words of Ezekiel, who saw dry bones breathe again. It burned in Jeremiah's voice, who wept for a people, but still declared hope. It stood in the furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refusing to bow. It closed the mouths of lions. When Daniel knelt to pray, wisdom had returned, not in palaces, but in prisons, not in riches, but in resilience, the kind of wisdom that cannot be bought and cannot be burned. It waits in silence. It speaks in storm. It walks with the faithful, even when the world forgets their names. Because God had not forgotten, the day would come when wisdom would not just whisper in dreams, it would walk in flesh. But until then, the echoes remained. The scrolls, the songs, the promises, still breathing, still calling to anyone willing to stop, listen, and ask again. Teach me, show me, lead me, because wisdom doesn't begin with knowledge. It begins with humility. And even now, it's waiting. The temple was gone. The walls, once covered in gold, now dust. The altar, scorched. The ark, lost. Jerusalem, once the city of peace, now sat silent, its gates broken, its people scattered like leaves in the wind. And yet, God was not gone, because even when the building falls, the presence remains. The prophet Ezekiel, sitting by a river in exile, saw a vision, not of despair, but of glory. He saw a new temple, measured not by cubits, but by wonder. He saw a river flowing from beneath the threshold, growing deeper and wider as it flowed, bringing life to everything it touched. Fish in the Dead Sea, trees along the banks, healing in the leaves. This was not a temple of stone. This was something more, a whisper, a promise that God would return, but not in the way they expected. No more curtains, no more incense, no more gates. One day, a child would be born, not in a palace, not to royalty, but to a quiet girl in a quiet town with heaven folded into her womb. And when he grew, he would speak with the wisdom of Solomon, but deeper. He would walk with the fire of Elijah, but gentler. He would say things that felt like thunder and water all at once. He would say, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." People laughed, scoffed. They didn't understand. He wasn't talking about stone. He was talking about himself, because he was the temple, the place where heaven and earth met, the Word made flesh, the presence walking barefoot through Galilean dust. And when he stretched his arms on the cross, the veil in the temple tore in two from top to bottom. No more barriers, no more boundaries. God was with us. And when he rose again, the temple didn't just return, it multiplied, because now every heart that believes becomes a dwelling place. Every life surrendered becomes holy ground, not polished, not perfect, but sacred. Paul would later write, "Do you not know you are God's temple, and his spirit dwells in you, not in marble, but in mercy, not behind curtains, but in your breath." The presence that once filled Solomon's temple now lives in quiet rooms, in whispered prayers, in broken hearts made whole. You are not far. You are not forgotten. You are a temple, a resting place of grace, a living sanctuary. And wisdom is closer than you think. It doesn't require gold or rituals or incense, just a heart willing to listen, to surrender, to trust. So tonight, as the world sleeps, as your thoughts quiet, as your breath slows, remember this. You carry what Solomon once longed to see, not in dreams, but in reality. The glory of God has made its home in you. Not every night is peaceful. Some nights are heavy, not because of noise, but because of silence. The kind of silence that feels like distance, like absence, like a question with no answer. And in those moments, the heart remembers how to pray, not with perfect words, not with rehearsed phrases, but with breath, with stillness, with tears that don't ask for permission. Tonight, if you find yourself there, in the space between hope and heaviness, you're not alone. Because even Solomon, with all his wisdom, wrote these words, "Even in laughter the heart may ache." And David, a king, a warrior, a poet, said, "How long, O Lord, Will you forget me forever? These were not weak men. They were honest men. Men who understood that sometimes strength looks like surrender. So if you're listening tonight with something weighing on your chest, a loss, a fear, a memory that won't let go, breathe. Just breathe. Let your prayer begin, not with words, but with being present, being real, being quiet long enough to feel that you're not the only one awake. Because in the dark, God is still there, not shouting, not scolding, but staying, listening, and sometimes that's the miracle. Not that the pain disappears, but that you're not abandoned in it. Solomon once prayed, "Hear from heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive." He didn't pray it in victory. He prayed it in humility, because the heart that truly seeks God doesn't demand miracles. It opens. So let's open for just a moment. Let this night become a sanctuary, not of gold, not of stone, but of breath, of honesty, of holy silence. If you need to cry, let it come. If you need to speak, speak aloud, even if no one's in the room. If you need to whisper, just say, "I'm here. I don't know what to do, but I trust you still see me." That is enough, more than enough, because prayer is not about performance. It's about presence. And the one who holds stars in his hands can hold your story too. He has walked through temples, through thrones, through fire and exile. And now he walks beside your bed. He sees your past and doesn't flinch. He sees your pain and doesn't pull away. He sees your heart broken, bruised, beating, and calls it beautiful. So tonight, as your body rests, let your soul rest too. Not in answers, but in presence. Not in certainty, but in closeness. You don't need to be strong. You only need to be willing to lay it all down, even if it's just a whisper. Because heaven hears what the world forgets, and the darkness is never too deep for God to find you in it. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. The world kept turning. But wisdom waited. It waited between the lines of old scrolls. It whispered in the wind across Jerusalem's ruins. It echoed in the voices of prophets who spoke of a day yet to come. A day when God would not only speak from the heavens, but walk the earth. Isaiah called him Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace. Jeremiah called him the Righteous Branch. Micah said he would be born in a small town called Bethlehem. And yet, for 400 years, there was silence. No fire from heaven. No voice in the temple. No visions in the night. Just silence. But not abandonment. Because sometimes silence is the sound of something sacred approaching. And then, in the dark of a stable, in the breath of a newborn, wisdom returned. But it didn't come with a crown, or thunder, or scrolls of gold. It came as a child, a baby wrapped in cloth, crying, breathing, blinking beneath starlight. The same voice that once filled the temple now gurgled in a mother's arms. He grew, not in palaces, but in simplicity not under torches, but under moonlight, along dusty roads, among fishermen and shepherds. And when he spoke, the world stilled, because his words were more than clever. They were true. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Love your enemies. Come to me, all who are weary." He told stories that reached the soul like fire through fog, of lost sons and hidden treasure, of mustard seeds that became trees. He did not just speak wisdom, he embodied it, the very heart of God beating a human chest. People marveled. They asked, where did this man get such wisdom? But they didn't know that Solomon's wisdom was only the shadow. This was the light. He walked into the temple courts, not with gold, but with grace. He taught not from scrolls, but from the Spirit. And when they asked him to prove himself, he said, something greater than Solomon is here. And he was right. Solomon sat on a throne. This man carried a cross. Solomon built a temple. This man became one. Solomon prayed for wisdom. This man was wisdom. And when he gave his life, it was not because he lacked power. It was because he had purpose. To take what was broken, divided kingdoms, shattered hearts, forgotten promises, and make them whole again, to fulfill every whisper of hope that had ever passed through a prophet's lips. And when he rose again, he gave something Solomon never could. Not just words, but spirit, a living presence, dwelling not in buildings, but in people. And suddenly, the temple was everywhere, in homes, in hearts, in anyone who dared to believe. That is the wisdom that waited and still waits, not in the halls of the powerful, but in the quiet moments when you choose to trust, when you open your heart, not to religion, but to relationship. Because wisdom is no longer a scroll. It is a person. And that person still calls out in the night, still knocks, still whispers, "Follow me." The kingdom they once dreamed of was never meant to be built by hands, not with cedar from Lebanon, not with stones from the quarry, not even with gold. It was always meant to be sung. And now, after centuries of silence, the song began again, not in royal courts, not in the temple, but on hillsides, around campfires, in whispered prayers and broken voices made whole. The kingdom had returned, but it looked nothing like Solomon's blanks. There were no golden lions on thrones, no armies lining the gates, no peacocks in palace gardens. Instead, there were meals shared with strangers, feet washed in silence, forgiveness spoken where law once condemned. It was a kingdom of reversal, where the first became last, where the mourners were blessed, where the meek inherited the earth, and its king wore a crown of thorns. He didn't conquer with swords. He conquered with surrender, with love so fierce, it refused to leave the lost behind. And as his spirit moved across the world, a new kind of temple rose, not made of walls, but of people, living stones, each one carrying the fire, each one humming the melody of something eternal. Paul called it the mystery revealed. Peter called it a royal priesthood. John simply called it love. Because in this kingdom, power serves, justice embraces, and mercy sings louder than shame. This was the song Solomon couldn't finish, the melody David longed to hear, the wisdom the prophet saw only in part. And now you hear it too. Maybe not with your ears, but with your spirit. That subtle, sacred pull that says you were made for more, not to build palaces, but to carry presence, not to chase gold, but to walk with grace, not to strive for perfection, but to rest in love. The kingdom isn't far, it's within you. Every time you forgive, it echoes. Every time you love without return, it grows. Every time you choose peace, when revenge is easier, you sing its song. You may not feel royal, you may not feel worthy, but the King has already called you his own. And when he returns, not as a carpenter, but as the rightful ruler of all things, he will gather every note ever sung in faith and turn it into a symphony. Until then, keep singing with your actions, with your trust, with your surrender, because the throne isn't in Jerusalem anymore. It's in every heart that makes room for the King. And the song, it never ends. You've walked through time tonight, past temples and thrones, prophets and promises. You've heard the rise of kings and the quiet fall of crowns. You felt the ache of silence and the warmth of presence, the weight of wisdom and the softness of grace. And now you can rest, not just your body, but your heart. Because no matter what this day held, its noise, its worry, its questions, you are here now. And here is enough. You are not in ancient Israel. You are not in Solomon's court. You are not by the ruins of a shattered temple. You are where the Spirit is, and that is holy ground. The same God who spoke from burning bushes and whispered through prophets now breathes in this room, near you, with you, for you. So let go gently of every burden. You don't have to carry tomorrow yet. It's still waiting in God's hands. You don't have to fix the past. It's already been seen by eyes more merciful than yours. Tonight is not about doing. It's about being still, being held, being loved. Let your breath slow. Let your muscles soften. Let your mind float like a boat released from shore. If thoughts come, greet them kindly, then let them pass like clouds. You don't need to analyze or solve or prove anything here. You just need to rest. And if your heart is tired, you're not alone. Even Jesus slept on a boat in a storm while the waves rose around him. He knew something the others didn't. That peace isn't the absence of the storm. It's the presence of trust. You can have that now, right here, a quiet surrender that whispers, I'm not in control, but I am held. That is enough. You are enough. Not because of what you've done, but because of who he is. A father who watches over your sleep, a shepherd who leads you gently, a king who reigns with mercy, a friend who stays even when the lights go out. So close your eyes, release your thoughts, and listen to the silence that heals, to the stillness that speaks, to the breath of God hovering softly over you, like it once hovered over the deep. You are safe. You are loved. You are never alone. Sleep now in peace. May this night wrap around you like a gentle cloak. May every breath you take be lighter than the one before. May the worries of today sink slowly beneath the still waters of holy rest. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are not too far gone. The God of Abraham still sees you. The God of Moses still leads you. The God of David still defends you. And the God of Solomon still whispers wisdom into the quiet corners of your soul. He does not sleep. He does not slumber. He watches not from a distance, but from within. Your sighs are prayers. Your stillness is enough. Your dreams are safe in his hands. And as you drift now, past thoughts, past sound, past the edges of waking, may you remember you are more than dust, more than fear, more than what this world tried to name you. You are a living temple, a carrier of grace, a chapter in the story God is still writing. So if you feel broken, he is the restorer. If you feel tired, he is the breath. And if all you can do is sleep, then sleep. Because even in that, he is near. No evil shall touch you here. No lie shall enter this sanctuary. No shadow shall hide his face. Only peace, only mercy, only love. May your dreams be soft, your spirit light, your soul wrapped in the music of heaven. You do not walk alone, even here in the deepest dark, because the light has come and the light stays. So now, rest, and may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you. May he give you peace until morning comes and you rise renewed.